Welcome to the Future Money podcast presented by the Interledger Foundation, where we explore innovative pathways to digital financial inclusion. I'm your host, Labil Karama, and today we have a fascinating conversation with Carol Ann Hilton, a pioneering voice in indigenous economics. Carol Ann Hilton is the CEO of the Indigenomics Institute and the founder of the Indigenomics movement. Her groundbreaking book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, challenges traditional economic frameworks, and through her work, she champions the inclusion of indigenous perspectives in global economic discussions and business development. Stay tuned for an insightful discussion on the evolving landscape of digital finance and driving meaningful change. So I wanted to welcome you to the Future Money podcast, Carol Ann Hilton, and thank you so much for being here as well. Could you introduce yourself to us?
Thank you. My name is Carol Ann Hilton. I'm the CEO and founder of the Global Center of Indigenomics and the Indigenomics Institute in Canada. I am Nuu-chah-nulth from the west coast of Vancouver Island in Canada. I belong to the Heshkwit Nation. I carry the traditional name Wakatush, which means big sister, and I come from the House of Mamayuch.
Thank you so much. So your traditional name, is that something you receive? Is that given to you by your community?
Yes, so it's passed down, and it's a name that represents my standing within the family and represents the strength of the lineage of women that I come from.
Truly an endearing name. It's beautiful. You are the founder of Indigenomics Thought. What does it mean to you, and what type of significance does it have in the world today?
Yeah, absolutely. Indigenomics on a number of fronts is bringing to the forefront today this concept of modern Indigenous economic design. And to be able to focus on this concept of economic exclusion, of economic injustice, and how that's been experienced by Indigenous people, both nationally and internationally, and to be able to address the implications of that over time. And I like this concept of building a seat at the economic table as a representation of how Indigenous peoples have been systematically excluded from financial and economic systems.
What inspired you to start out with this concept? I see it as an act of care for your community.
Yeah, absolutely. In Canada, we have a concept called the Indian Act, which the original intention was the entire elimination of indigeneity. And through policy, through lands, through elimination of culture and displacement, that systemic approach to a future without Indigenous people, I think seeing the generational long-term impacts of that exclusion and the fact that the resilience that my family, my community, my nation, and entire regions are still rebuilding internally as nations, as families, and to realize that space of right now of how important that is. That, I'm the first generation out of the residential school system here in Canada, and I take that very seriously, of the lack of freedom that previous generations have experienced, the lack of voice and the lack of access to resources and all of those things. And the experience of poverty is in itself a veil that covers the truth of the experience of exclusion. And in all of those truths, my inspiration has been drawn in the development of the concept of Indigenomics. The other aspect is, while the initial idea was formed under the technological use of the hashtag to bring a core narrative together using the hashtag, that essentially the evolution of it into a technology platform. I also find the contrast between traditional economic values and practices and modern technology to be entirely fascinating and a powerful place that also demonstrates our resilience and our ability to respond to our past, to our current, and to our future.
How do you see the indigenomic economic systems or values even differ from the current economic models and systems that we have?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that this concept of prosperity and abundance and what that is centered in, we hear that throughout the world, really, of Indigenous worldview, of, the well-being of the earth, the well-being of responsibility and the practices of that, and that time and responsibility, decision making are all interrelated. And that is so different than what we see within a Western construct of economics, where the immediacy and short termism is in direct contrast to generational thinking and responsibility and teachings that are represented within Indigenous economic worldview.
For me personally, I see the difference within how you give to the land, but also how you take from it.
Mhm.
For me, there's a very different act of taking from it. If I look at it from a Western point of view compared to what is my own Indigenous point of view, is where we give to the land back to make sure it actually prospers.
I think that concept and practice of reciprocity is expressed in Indigenous languages of how you care for, how you harvest resources, and how that is transferred as a resource across generations. And the decision making that supports that and the governing structures that support that are so complex, but also so based on core principles from an Indigenous worldview that it becomes apparent over thousands of generations the success of what that means and how that's practiced.
So, how do you, from traditional Indigenous values such as community, but also reciprocity, as you previously mentioned, shape these economies towards a future facing role? How do you adopt all of these changes?
I really like centering the concept of the Indigenomics movement, specifically as a financial, economic, and technology innovation platform. To understand that the movement itself, the purpose is to be able to facilitate modern value creation through equitable participation and looking at the practices of Indigenous language of business and how it's used, how that facilitates concepts of sustainable regenerative economic activity. I was in the Northwest Territories a couple years back and sitting with a circle of Indigenous entrepreneurs, and each one of them was so elegantly able to articulate the teachings within the practice of their business and land based businesses, and understanding how specifically and essential that is of the generative ecological aspect of business itself. And I think how that language has been transferred into the function of business today through Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs, it becomes really important to pay attention to how Indigenous businesses are excelling, how they're moving beyond existing systems and processes of sustainable regenerative business practices. So I think Indigenous businesses have so much to offer and so much to pay attention to and offer an alternative to the short term perspectives of what we're told economy is and what financial accountability is today as well.
And could you share examples of successful Indigenous led initiatives, either historical or current?
Yeah, absolutely. I think here in BC, there's an example. There's Salish soils in the Seashell region on the west coast of BC of a regenerative approach to Indigenous perspectives around soil, and building this as a business becomes so important to understand how Indigenous values and practices are infused into the business model and how that language shapes the approach and values and centering that in what the business is about. There's also a group, Tea Creek, up in Hazelton area in BC, that's doing tremendous work around Indigenous food sovereignty and systems work around Indigenous knowledge systems and really engaging young people and looking at skill transfer and knowledge development in a really powerful way. And I think there's another group in the Yukon called Yukon Soaps that looks at land based practices for harvesting and traditional knowledge to create and design products that reflect the Yukon landscape and teaching and practices and maintains those within the business model. In each one of those examples, I think, reflect how thoughtfully Indigenous teachings are facilitated through Indigenous businesses. And it's really powerful to see that transmitted and transformed into modern business practices today.
Mhm. I'm going to take a different type of turn. And that is, at the Interledger Foundation, our focus is digital financial inclusion. And we will ask all of our guests, like, what does digital financial inclusion mean to you, to your community, to your surroundings, and within your own practice and within your own work? What do you focus on?
I think that the experience of financial exclusion can only truly be known by those who have been excluded. To look at solutions that are driven without truly listening to what that experience has been and how that's been perpetuated across time, that's essential to really facilitate a common understanding of what that is and what that means and what that experience has been. And I think this concept of financial inclusion represents an interruption in this concept of kind of the disadvantaged, the displaced, the marginalized. And there's uncomfortable conversations to be had in that of who is doing that, how is that being done, what has that experience been. So financial inclusion to me means to have the difficult conversations of what that experience of exclusion has been. In my first book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, to be able to use that metaphor of Indigenous peoples taking our seat at the economic table in a place that was denied to us, it becomes really important to name that process and name that experience and name that structure of how that's happened and how policy today perpetuates that. And while we see that at an economic level, that's also happened systematically within the financial systems, where the absence of access to capital, the absence of capacity in terms of Indigenous communities and management and governing systems that have experienced a top down externalized perception of governance. So I think governing systems, decision making, Indigenous led, Indigenous owned, all of those are foundational elements to building the space for Indigenous inclusion today. And that doesn't just mean for the individual, that can mean for the family, for the community, for Indigenous businesses, economic development corporations, that whole spectrum of business and economic activities.
How easy is it to have a seat at the table? If you think about contemporary society, can you say that you're finally accepted at the table, or is it still a fight?
I just finished writing my second book, which is called The Rise of Indigenous Economic Power and the Deconstruction of Indian Act Economics. In the movement of the rise of Indigenous economic power, what that has meant was increasing access to capital. What that has meant has been Indigenous-led investment structures. It means interruption into the capital markets, where Indigenous participation is seen as a strategic advantage. It means new behaviors, such as an increasing trend of Indigenous people sitting on corporate boards, where those boards are making decisions about resources within our territories. So there's various elements of financial inclusion that I think moves beyond what we would think of kind of the program and service capacity, individual development, to look at development as an experience of community, of nation building, and of the ability to facilitate self-determination today.
So, what are the main challenges today for Indigenous economies? If you are addressing the steps you've gone through towards like these positions, what are other challenges you're focused on?
I'm really focused on the experience of the lack of data, externalized systems of management of data, which in its absence creates a inability for decision making or investment or to actually see the growth of Indigenous economy and business and the need for investment into them. Those challenges represent the lack of response of understanding what actual Indigenous economic power is. Here in Canada, in the work of Indigenomics, of describing a forward-looking number of $100 billion annual Indigenous economy, either side of that, to be below 100 billion, to be above 100 billion, requires the financial sector to recognize Indigenous businesses as a strategic advantage, to recognize the internal processes or decision making where that inclusion exists or doesn't exist, and the thoughtful advancement of inclusion means specific economic outcomes. That means increased investment. It means increased access. It means increased Indigenous businesses. It means increased economic activity. So the collective advancement of the Indigenous economy, I think, refers to a consistent need to respond to what Indigenous economic power and resilience is today.
What's up, listeners? I'm Aisha Ware, Program Manager at the Interledger Foundation, and we've got something exciting for you. I recently collaborated with Grammy Award-nominated mixed media artist Carolyn Malachi, who teaches a course on advanced audio production at Howard University. The course challenges students to develop amazing audio projects, including film scores, audiobooks, and of course, podcasts. For the next few episodes of the Future Money podcast, we'll be sharing an exclusive audio piece about Interledger, produced and edited by one of Carolyn's students. Please enjoy this sample, created by Emily Green.
The Interledger Summit is a global gathering held by the Global Interoperable Payments Network, Interledger, with the hopes of connecting the people who are transforming the future of digital financial services through open tech. By bringing together innovators, regulators, and anyone excluded from essential services to build equity and inclusion, we hope to create new opportunities. This is your chance to hear from changemakers, artists, and innovators who are looking for new ways to do things, solve the problems in the communities, and make a world where everyone is included. You won't want to miss this opportunity to network with people that will change the world. Visit interledger.org/summit to discover more and explore how digital financial services can work for everyone, everywhere.
I am amazed by the remarkably talented students at Howard University. Let me tell you, I've seen firsthand how Carolyn's course has equipped them with the practical skills and real-world experience needed to excel in the audio industry, and I cannot wait to see what they all do next. Now back to the show.
So how can other businesses and governments that are external to Indigenous communities support your growth, like without imposing their values towards your communities?
I think that we're seeing here, particularly in Canada, two significant trends. One of those includes procurement as an economic tool for inclusion, that increasing a wider net of available Indigenous businesses to support their increased capacity to respond to regional needs in the supply chain. I refer to that as kind of reconciliation within the supply chain, and governments and businesses are increasingly looking at that as an economic tool for inclusion. I think the other aspect that we're seeing significant advancement around is the development of reconciliation action plans by companies. In Canada specifically, this was a reflection of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to action, which was a response to the survivors of the residential school system. Specifically, call to action created a pathway for corporations to create meaningful pathways for engagement with Indigenous peoples and businesses. And in doing so, creating accountable outcomes-based action plans that facilitate economic outcomes and social and economic well-being. Those are foundational trends that understanding their placement in creating positive outcomes is essential today.
So what role of technology and innovation do you believe play in advancing these Indigenous models? I'm asking this question also because of the Interledger Foundation and our background as the steward of the Interledger protocol. If you think about our technology, like what would we be able to do to drive indigenous economic models, but also other parties?
Speaking from an Indigenomics perspective, our work in this movement is really about leveraging advanced tools such as AI, building data intelligence, and the utilization of blockchain to build technology platforms that we describe as an economic intelligence engine that has the ability to enhance data driven insights for stronger participation, increased activity, whether that's increased investment, increased partnerships. And I think today, in a similar vein of the work of Interledger, the alignment of leading edge technology with Indigenous economic priorities, I think that there's a space for traditional knowledge systems to align with digital economies and the space to foster innovation, leadership, and lastly, to position Indigenous peoples and their businesses in a leadership space that can shape the future of economic and technological progress with Indigenous peoples having a seat at that table really important. And I think there's this strong space of both Interledger and the Indigenomics movement in facilitating the space for leading edge technology and innovation with financial inclusion.
I completely agree. So, what steps can be taken to ensure that these communities maintain control and ownership of their economic ventures? Because previously you mentioned that there's a lack of data, which is very important. There's a negative connotation towards it, but there's also a positive connotation towards it. It means that the data you're building out right now is something that you have ownership over. What are other steps to be taken by Indigenous communities to maintain control and ownership of their economic ventures and not to be overrun by these larger organizations?
Yeah, what I see is a really strong and powerful structure that represents the increasing ability of communities and Indigenous nations that at the foundation is self-determination and self-governance, but that includes the protections of lands and waters and the increased role of Indigenous rights and responsibility and the need for recognition of protected areas. The Indigenous protected and conserved area structures nationally and globally are creating a space for governance, for sustainable economy, and represents a space of Indigenous led, Indigenous owned, and Indigenous knowledge systems based in long term sustainability. I think really represents that innovation space and modern structures that can represent a return as a response to how we were displaced and how we can create our own place within today and within our future.
Based on that answer, how do you envision partnerships between Indigenous but also non-Indigenous communities to be evolving? Because I believe that I don't want to call it a fight, but there are two communities coming together and converging, but there's also the need to establish one to ensure that it will prosper because the current one is more dominant.
I think that a framework that can support that thinking is through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to recognize and the entry point of a relationship, which historically was largely extractive or dominant, to shift towards recognition and inclusion. And the process of that, what the tools are and the language that's available in front of us, I think UNDRIP can represent a foundational entry point of recognition as the foundation of a partnership and of a relationship.
Within your own process and project and the two books, I mean, you recently published your second book. What are personal experiences or projects within the Indigenomics institution that you're most proud of?
I think that they're kind of multifold, but in the same dimension is placing the visual narrative of Indigenous economic power in national identity through the concept of Indigenomics the narrative shift, I think, has been really important, that activating outcomes, activating plans, activating policies, activating investments as a participation in advancing Indigenous reconciliation and economic outcomes has been powerful to witness. And I think that the evolution of this past year through the establishment of the global Indigenomics Now event, where we set out to realign economy from an Indigenous worldview, the alignment to happen through time and through natural ecological systems. So, as a 24-hour online event, what we were able to do was bring Indigenous worldview into the agenda of how we related to each other, how we participated, and the content itself. So, looking at the moon system, looking at the sun, looking at the directions, looking at time, all of those aspects as the natural world to be reflected in how we connected, of uplifting a global narrative of Indigenous, sustainable, generative Indigenous business, and using that as a platform to begin to ask the formative question, what does an Indigenous World Economic Forum need to become?
And what came out of that question once that was asked? Like, what directions did people go into? Or were you able to have like an outcome document?
Yeah, so we're still going to be developing kind of 3 to 4 more of those events, and then utilizing that as a language model that upholds Indigenous worldview and upholds Indigenous perspective of global Indigenous economic activity. So last year was our first year, and coming year will also be held again on the full moon in October, harvest moon, and really bringing critical perspectives in Indigenous language, Indigenous philosophy, and tangible examples of Indigenous businesses that are activating those principles within their business models.
So the next event for our listeners, the next event will be in October during the harvest moon, full moon, so that everybody's aware of it. And I will tag the previous one so you can already see it on the website. I actually wanted to know, how do you balance like traditional Indigenous practices then with the demands of a global economy? You kind of like mentioned the event as a starting point of acknowledgement, but the conversations on how to balance out these practices, like incorporating your own values and your pathways into it, and then also coming together as a community, having these conversations that are truly needed. But I was also wondering, as a person, how do you balance your own traditional Indigenous practices with the current global economy?
I think one of the major ones is advancing in creating a space for Indigenous economic justice. So we see tremendous movement of land recognition, of rights recognition, of land return, addressing historical injustices. I think that's fundamental to uphold the truths of what's happened, to legally test an imposed externalized system. I think that Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned financial systems and structures are increasingly becoming accessible, where Indigenous values around investments and access and growth from an Indigenous perspective are now today something that is becoming increasingly possible. I think the foundation has to be upholding and advancing Indigenous economic self-determination, and realizing that part of that is dismantling what has happened and the effects of that. And the other aspect is advancing how we take up space, and that concept of taking our seat at the economic table. How do we do that? And I think the other aspect is Indigenous trade, to realize that those historical trade routes make up a lot of the modern highways that we see today, and that the historical relationships across nations and across territories, the trading relationships, was fundamental to our success as people over time. I also think creating in the space of digital transformation, highlighting Indigenous businesses that can be described as models for future generations, that what we do today brings forward what is possible for business practices in the future that's based on sustainability. Framing the language around what is sustainable or regenerative Indigenous business, describing the pathway of modern Indigenous economic design, all of those as practices from a community's perspective or within a metric of Indigenous economic participation. All of those aspects are really important in that.
So what lessons can we now learn from the current frameworks and practices already?
I think that testing the legal systems of what's been prescribed for us as Indigenous people to uphold the pathway of economic justice, of whether that's land return, of the requirement to uphold and recognize us as people and to uphold us as having rights, as the original right holders. All of those are lessons that in Canada in particular, we're looking at a federal government that has been tested, I think, over 360 times, where the federal government has lost. So I think that what happens in the courtrooms can be expressed in the economy. And that's a really important feature of Indigenous peoples taking up space within the reclamation of our economies and traditional systems.
I have a question. It's a question that we ask all of our guests, and it's about envisioning the future. It's not about the flying cars or the movie Back to the Future, but it's about how you would envision or what you would dream of the world to be in about 10 to 20 years. I sometimes ask people to go bigger and go more crazy because of the fact that if you, from your perspective, could create the world that you believe that should be there from an Indigenomics perspective, what would that be like?
I think that in the work of Indigenomics as a long-term outcome and as building an effect to address the implications of the short-term perspective of everything we've been told what economy is, to interrupt that with an Indigenous-led financial structure that perpetuates investment into sustainability, with the foundation of AI intelligence that examines and upholds successful business structures. From my perspective, the Indigenomics movement is upholding this concept of life at the center as an investment model that perpetuates the return to the concept of market, of being life itself, of being a sustainable, regenerative, ecological experience of living on Mother Earth. And I think to advance a generational impact investment model that perpetuates and upholds the concept of life, that to me is a success and the purpose of Indigenomics as a contribution to humanity.
That's very beautiful said. So thank you so much, Carolina Hilton, for being part of the Future Money podcast. You just published your new book. Where can our listeners find your book?
Yeah, absolutely. The signed copies are available at indigenomics.com. They're available through my publisher at New Society Publishing and available on bookshelves as well as the e-commerce platforms like Amazon.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So from the 1st of April, the book will be available on all of the e-commerce platforms. And I will link the book in the description so you can purchase it online already. And then once it's available on the platforms, I will link that as well. So make sure you're aware and purchase the book and read it. Thank you so much, Carolina Hilton. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Future Money podcast. Special thanks to Carol Ann Hilton for sharing her expertise and vision for transformative economic change. Her insights on bridging traditional Indigenous knowledge with modern financial systems offer valuable lessons for creating more inclusive digital economies. Join us next time as we continue to explore groundbreaking approaches to digital financial inclusion. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who are passionate about digital financial inclusion and innovation. This is Labil Karama, signing off from the Future Money podcast.